Flight 847 was cruising at 30,000 feet when both engines suddenly went silent. 200 passengers sat in darkness as their Boeing 737 began falling from the sky. The captain frantically worked the controls, but nothing responded. In the cabin below, a woman named Cassandra Mitchell unbuckled her seatbelt and walked toward the cockpit. 3 months earlier, she'd been stripped of her pilot's license and banned from flying. But today, she was about to break every rule in aviation history to save everyone on board. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of March 15th started like any other Tuesday for Captain Cassandra Mitchell. She pulled into the employee parking lot of Denver International Airport at 5:47 a.m., her coffee still steaming in the cup holder of her Honda Accord. 23 years of flying commercial aircraft had taught her to arrive early, prepare thoroughly, and never take shortcuts. These principles had kept her accident-free through over 18,000 flight hours and earned her a reputation as one of the most reliable pilots at Summit Airlines. Cassandra had dreamed of flying since she was 7 years old, watching jets streak across the Nebraska sky from her grandmother's farm. Her path wasn't easy. She was among the first generation of women to break into commercial aviation in significant numbers, facing skepticism and outright hostility from some colleagues who believed the cockpit was no place for a woman. But she proved them wrong, flight by flight, earning respect through competence and unshakable professionalism. That morning in March, she was scheduled to fly Flight 209 from Denver to Seattle, a routine 3-hour journey she'd completed hundreds of times. The Boeing 737-800 was in excellent condition. The weather forecast was clear, and her co-pilot was Jake Richardson, a competent young aviator she'd flown with many times before. Everything seemed perfectly normal as she conducted her pre-flight inspection, checking systems and reviewing weather reports with the methodical precision that had defined her entire career. The first sign of trouble came during taxi to the runway. Air traffic control informed Captain Mitchell that Flight 209 would be delayed due to a security concern that needed immediate investigation. This wasn't entirely unusual post-9/11s. Protocols meant that even minor irregularities could trigger extended security reviews. Cassandra acknowledged the delay and began the standard procedure of updating passengers and preparing for an extended ground wait. What she didn't know was that 3 rows behind the cockpit, Federal Air Marshal Derek Hoffman was becoming increasingly concerned about a passenger in seat 12C. The man, later identified as Marcus Webb, had been acting strangely since boarding. He'd made several trips to the bathroom, seemed nervous and agitated, and had been observed manipulating something inside his carry-on bag. Marshal Hoffman's training kicked in, and he discreetly notified airport security of his concerns. Within minutes, the aircraft was surrounded by security vehicles. Passengers watched through windows as bomb-sniffing dogs and tactical teams took positions around the plane. The evacuation order came swiftly. All passengers and crew were to deplane immediately for security screening. Cassandra followed protocol, shutting down engines and securing the aircraft before joining the exodus down the emergency slides. Investigation that followed was thorough and terrifying. Hidden inside Marcus Webb's laptop bag, security personnel discovered 3 small explosive devices, crude but potentially lethal if detonated during flight. The devices were sophisticated enough to suggest serious intent and capability, though investigators later determined they were actually elaborate fakes, part of what Webb claimed was a social experiment to test airport security, but the damage was done. During the security investigation, a critical detail emerged that would destroy Cassandra's career. While reviewing security footage from the gate area, investigators noticed that Webb had briefly approached Captain Mitchell near the boarding door. The interaction lasted less than 30 seconds, Webb had simply asked about departure time, and Cassandra had politely provided the information. In the context of a potential terrorist threat, however, this brief exchange took on sinister significance. Federal investigators began questioning whether Captain Mitchell had somehow been compromised. Had Webb passed her information? Had she been recruited as an inside accomplice? The fact that she'd been completely unaware of Webb's identity or intentions didn't matter. In the post-9/11's aviation environment, even the appearance of a security breach was enough to trigger the most severe consequences. The Federal Aviation Administration launched a comprehensive investigation into Cassandra's background, financial records, and associations. They interviewed her neighbors, examined her phone records, and subjected her to multiple polygraph tests. Despite passing every examination and having zero evidence of wrongdoing, the mere fact that she'd interacted with a suspected terrorist, however, innocently created an insurmountable problem. Summit Airlines, under pressure from federal regulators and desperate to avoid any association with the security incident, made the decision that would shatter Cassandra's world. On April 8th, just 3 weeks after the Flight 209 incident, she was called into Chief Pilot Margaret Foster's office and informed that her employment was being terminated, effective immediately. Her pilot's license was suspended pending the completion of the federal investigation, and she was banned from all airport property. The termination wasn't just the end of a job, it was the destruction of everything she'd worked for. In aviation, a security-related dismissal is a career death sentence. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit community of commercial pilots. Airlines share information about terminated employees, especially those involved in security issues. Within days, Cassandra found herself blacklisted from every major carrier in the country. The financial impact was immediate and devastating. Commercial airline pilots earn substantial salaries, often over $200,000 annually for senior captains. Cassandra had built her life around that income. Her mortgage, car payments, and retirement planning all assumed continued employment. Without income and facing legal expenses from the ongoing investigation, she quickly burned through her savings. Worse than the financial stress was the psychological toll. Cassandra had defined herself as a pilot for over 2 decades. Flying wasn't just her profession, it was her identity, her passion, and her purpose. Being grounded felt like being stripped of her soul. She would lie awake at night, listening to aircraft pass overhead, feeling a physical ache for the cockpit she might never see again. The media attention made everything worse. Local news stations picked up the story of the pilot linked to terrorist suspect, conveniently omitting the fact that her only connection was a 30-second conversation about departure times. Her photograph appeared in newspapers alongside headlines that implied guilt by association. Former colleagues began avoiding her calls. Friends became scarce. Her reputation, built over decades of flawless service, crumbled in weeks. By June, Cassandra was working at a Home Depot in Aurora, Colorado, helping customers select paint colors and garden supplies. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent years navigating aircraft through complex airspace at 500 miles per hour, and now she was struggling to explain the difference between semi-gloss and satin finish to weekend homeowners. Her manager, a kind woman named Patricia, who knew nothing about aviation, often commented on how overqualified Cassandra seemed for retail work. The federal investigation finally concluded in August, officially clearing Cassandra of any wrongdoing. The FBI determined that her interaction with Marcus Webb was completely innocent and that she'd had no knowledge of his intentions or devices. But vindication came too late. Her pilot's license was restored, but no airline would hire her. The stigma of being associated, however peripherally, with a security incident made her unemployable in commercial aviation. Cassandra tried everything to resurrect her career. She applied to cargo airlines, charter companies, and even small regional carriers. Some interviews went well until the inevitable background check revealed the Flight 209 incident. Others ended the moment she disclosed her termination from Summit Airlines. Aviation is a small industry built on trust and risk management. Airlines simply couldn't afford to take chances on pilots with any security-related history. Regardless of the circumstances, depression set in during the fall months. Cassandra had always been a strong, independent woman who solved problems through preparation and hard work. But this problem couldn't be solved through effort or competence. She was trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare where innocence didn't matter, only perception and liability. Some days she couldn't bring herself to get out of bed. Other days she would drive to the airport just to watch planes take off, torturing herself with memories of what she'd lost. Her sister Emma, a nurse in Phoenix, begged Cassandra to consider a fresh start in a different field. "You're brilliant," Emma would say during their weekly phone calls. "You could do anything, become a teacher, go to law school, start a business. You don't have to let this define you." But Cassandra couldn't imagine being anything other than a pilot. It was like asking a painter to give up color or a musician to abandon sound. By December, she'd lost her house to foreclosure and moved into a small apartment near the Home Depot where she worked. Her Honda had been repossessed, replaced by a used bicycle for transportation. The woman who'd once commanded million-dollar aircraft was struggling to pay for groceries. But the worst part wasn't the material losses. It was the crushing sense that justice didn't exist, that doing everything right could still lead to total ruin. Christmas Eve found Cassandra working the closing shift at the home improvement store, helping last-minute shoppers find holiday decorations and repair supplies. The store was nearly empty by 8 p.m., and she was looking forward to going home to her quiet apartment and trying not to think about the fact that she should have been flying holiday travelers to their families instead of selling them extension cords and light bulbs. That's when she saw the news report on the break room television. Marcus Webb, the man whose fake terrorism stunt had destroyed her life, had been sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. The reporter mentioned that his social experiment had cost taxpayers over $2 million in security responses and had unfairly impacted several innocent individuals whose lives were disrupted by his reckless actions. Several innocent individuals. That's what 9 months of hell had reduced her to, a footnote in someone else's story of stupidity and attention-seeking. Cassandra stared at the television screen, feeling something shift inside her chest. It wasn't anger exactly, though she'd felt plenty of that. It was something colder and more focused, a crystalline clarity about the injustice she'd endured and the system that had failed her so completely. She turned off the television, finished her shift, and rode her bicycle home through the cold Denver night. Tomorrow was Christmas, and she would spend it alone in her tiny apartment. But for the first time in months, she wasn't thinking about what she'd lost. She was thinking about what she still knew, what no bureaucrat or airline executive could take away from her. 23 years of knowledge about how to fly aircraft, how to handle emergencies, and how to make life or death decisions under pressure. Cassandra didn't know it yet, but in exactly 4 months and 6 days, all of that knowledge would be put to the ultimate test. On a Tuesday afternoon in April, she would board Flight 847 as a passenger, not a pilot. And when disaster struck at 30,000 feet, everything she'd learned in 2 decades of flying would be the only thing standing between 200 people and certain death. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. April 29th dawned gray and overcast in Denver, with spring rain drumming against the windows of Cassandra's studio apartment. She'd worked a double shift the previous day, staying until midnight to help with inventory at the Home Depot, and her body ached from lifting boxes of ceramic tiles and bags of concrete mix. At 38 years old, the physical demands of retail work were taking a toll she'd never experienced during her flying. Years. Her phone buzzed at 6:23 a.m. with a text from her sister. Emma, flight booked for your interview tomorrow. Southwest 847. Departs Den at 2:15 p.m. Don't overthink this opportunity. Cass, Phoenix needs good people. The interview was for a position as a flight training coordinator at a small aviation academy in Phoenix. It wasn't flying, but it would put her back in the world of aviation, working with student pilots and helping them understand aircraft systems. The pay was less than half what she'd earned as a commercial captain, but it represented hope, a chance to rebuild some connection to the career that had defined her life. Cassandra had initially resisted Emma's suggestion to move to Arizona. Starting over in a new state felt like admitting defeat, acknowledging that her aviation career in Colorado was truly dead. But 9 months of retail work had worn down her pride. She needed to accept that her old life was gone and try to construct something new from the pieces that remained. She spent the morning cleaning her apartment and packing a small overnight bag. The interview was scheduled for Wednesday morning, and she planned to spend Tuesday night at Emma's house, catching up with her sister and meeting her 2 nephews for the first time since Christmas 2 years ago. It would be good to be around family again, to remember what life was like outside the narrow world of work and financial stress she'd been inhabiting. At 1:15 p.m., Cassandra arrived at Denver International Airport for the first time since her termination from Summit Airlines. Walking through the terminal felt surreal. She knew every gate, every checkpoint, every corridor from years of crew briefings and passenger connections. But now she was just another traveler, carrying a boarding pass and coach instead of a crew badge and captain's stripes. Security was a particular ordeal. The TSA agent who checked her ID spent an unusually long time examining her driver's license and comparing it to some information on his computer screen. Cassandra realized with a sinking feeling that her name was probably still flagged in the system from the Flight 209 incident. After several minutes and a consultation with the supervisor, she was allowed to proceed. But the experience served as a bitter reminder of how completely her reputation had been destroyed. Southwest Flight 847 was already boarding when she reached Gate 37. The Boeing 737-700 looked identical to aircraft she'd flown hundreds of times, and she felt a familiar mixture of excitement and melancholy watching passengers stream down the jet bridge. This should have been her domain, the cockpit, the pre-flight preparations, the responsibility for everyone's safety. Instead, she was passenger 94B, settling into a middle seat between a college student playing video games and a businessman already asleep against the window. Captain Jennifer Walsh's voice came over the intercom with the standard pre-departure announcement. Cassandra found herself automatically evaluating the pilot's tone and delivery. Professional, confident, with just enough warmth to put nervous passengers at ease. It was exactly how she used to sound during her own announcements, back when she had the authority to speak for the aircraft and its crew. As Flight 847 pushed back from the gate, Cassandra felt the familiar acceleration of taxi and the subtle shifts that indicated turns toward the runway. Despite everything that had happened, being in an aircraft still felt like coming home. The sounds, the sensations, the ordered chaos of departure procedures, it all triggered muscle memory from thousands of hours in cockpits, making her fingers unconsciously twitch as if reaching for controls that weren't there. Takeoff was smooth and routine. The 737 climbed steadily through scattered clouds, and within 20 minutes they were cruising at 36,000 feet above the Colorado Rockies. Cassandra tried to focus on the magazine she'd brought, but her attention kept drifting to the subtle sounds of the engines and the barely perceptible movements that indicated how the aircraft was responding to atmospheric conditions. Her trained ear automatically assessed everything: engine performance, pressurization systems, the slight turbulence that meant they were probably encountering the jet stream. Flight attendant Maria Santos was working the middle section of the cabin, and Cassandra watched her professional efficiency with something approaching envy. At least Maria still had her career in aviation, still got to be part of the complex choreography that made commercial flight possible. Cassandra wondered if she'd ever again experience the satisfaction of being part of a flight crew, of having a vital role in safely transporting people across the country. The first sign of trouble came at 3:47 p.m., roughly an hour and a half into the flight. Cassandra was dozing when she felt the aircraft shudder slightly, not the normal buffeting of turbulence, but something different, something that made her pilot instincts immediately alert. She opened her eyes and listened carefully. The engine noise had changed, becoming less consistent, with a subtle vibration that shouldn't have been there. Most passengers didn't notice anything unusual. The college student continued his game, the businessman remained asleep, and conversations throughout the cabin proceeded normally. But Cassandra's trained senses detected the anomaly immediately. Something was wrong with the engines, though she couldn't yet determine the exact nature of the problem. Over the next few minutes, the symptoms became more pronounced. The vibration increased, and the engine sound developed an irregular quality that set off alarm bells in Cassandra's memory. She'd encountered similar symptoms during a training simulation years ago, an exercise designed to test pilot responses to dual-engine problems at high altitude. The scenario had been considered so unlikely that many pilots treated it as an academic exercise rather than a realistic possibility. At 3:52 p.m., the first engine failed completely. The sound was unmistakable to anyone with aviation experience. A sudden decrease in the background, noise that indicated one of the two engines had stopped producing thrust. The aircraft immediately began compensating, and Cassandra felt the subtle yaw and roll corrections as the autopilot system worked to maintain straight and level flight on single-engine power. Captain Walsh's voice came over the intercom, calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're experiencing a minor mechanical issue and will be diverting to Salt Lake City as a precaution. We expect to land in approximately 30 minutes. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for approach." Cassandra knew the announcement was designed to avoid panic, but her pilot training allowed her to read between the lines. A minor mechanical issue that required an immediate diversion usually meant something serious. Single-engine operation was manageable, but it reduced the aircraft's performance capabilities and eliminated redundancy for critical systems. The second engine failed at 3:58 p.m. This time, the change was dramatic and obvious to everyone on board. The steady background hum that passengers barely noticed suddenly went silent, replaced by an eerie quiet broken only by the whistle of air passing over the fuselage. The aircraft immediately began losing altitude as the autopilot struggled to maintain flight without engine thrust. Emergency lighting illuminated throughout the cabin as backup electrical systems activated. Flight attendants quickly moved to their positions, beginning the practiced routine for preparing passengers for emergency landing procedures. Their voices were professional and reassuring, but Cassandra could see the controlled fear in their movements. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing an emergency situation," Captain Walsh announced, her voice still steady but with new urgency. "We have lost both engines and are beginning emergency descent procedures. Flight attendants will now demonstrate brace positions and emergency evacuation procedures." The words sent shockwaves through the cabin. Passengers who had been reading or sleeping suddenly became fully alert. Parents pulled children closer. Some people began crying. Others sat in stunned silence, trying to process the reality that their routine flight had become a life-threatening emergency. Cassandra's mind immediately shifted into the analytical mode that had served her throughout her flying career. Without engine power, the Boeing 737 was essentially a heavy glider with limited options. At 30,000 feet, they had perhaps 12 to 15 minutes of gliding time before reaching the ground. The question was whether that time would be sufficient to reach a suitable landing site. Salt Lake City International Airport was still over 100 miles away, too far to reach without engine power. Captain Walsh would need to find an alternative, and the choices in the mountainous terrain of eastern Utah were extremely limited. Cassandra mentally reviewed the airports in the region, calculating distances and runway lengths, trying to determine what options the flight crew might be considering. The descent was steeper now, as Captain Walsh traded altitude for airspeed to maintain control of the aircraft. Through her window, Cassandra could see the dramatic landscape of the Colorado Plateau passing beneath them. Under normal circumstances, the view would have been breathtaking. Now, it represented a hostile environment where any mistake in navigation or aircraft handling would be fatal for everyone on board. Flight attendant Maria Santos was moving through the cabin, checking that seatbelts were fastened and helping passengers understand the brace position. When she reached Cassandra's row, something in the passenger's demeanor caught her attention. "Are you all right, ma'am?" Maria asked, noticing that Cassandra seemed unusually calm compared to other passengers, and was looking out the window with intense concentration rather than fear. "I'm fine," Cassandra replied. "But I think we need to talk." "I'm a commercial pilot." Maria's eyes widened. In emergency situations, flight attendants were trained to identify passengers with relevant expertise who might be able to assist the crew. A pilot passenger represented an invaluable resource, someone who understood aircraft systems and emergency procedures. "What's your background?" Maria asked quickly. 23 years flying commercial aircraft, mostly 737s. I was a captain with Summit Airlines until last year. Cassandra didn't mention the circumstances of her departure. There would be time for explanations later. "If they survived, I need to inform the captain immediately," Maria said. "Would you be willing to come to the cockpit if requested?" Cassandra nodded. For the first time in months, she felt the familiar surge of purpose that came with being needed in an aviation emergency. Her personal problems, her terminated career, her financial struggles, none of that mattered now. 200 people were depending on the skill and experience of their flight crew, and she had knowledge that might help save their lives. As Maria hurried toward the front of the aircraft to communicate with the cockpit crew, Cassandra continued her analysis of their situation. The aircraft was descending through 18,000 feet now, still too high and too far from any suitable airport. She estimated they had perhaps 8 minutes before reaching a critically low altitude where landing options would become extremely limited. The intercom crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Walsh. We are currently looking for the nearest suitable airport for an emergency landing. Please remain calm, follow all instructions from the flight attendants, and prepare for what may be a rough touchdown. We will do everything in our power to bring you home safely." Cassandra knew that behind the calm professionalism of that announcement, the cockpit crew was facing one of the most challenging situations in aviation. Dual engine failure at high altitude was every pilot's nightmare, a scenario that required split-second decision-making, precise aircraft handling, and more than a little luck. She found herself silently reviewing emergency procedures, calculating glide ratios, and trying to anticipate what decisions Captain Walsh would need to make in the next few critical minutes. The call from the cockpit came at 4:06 p.m., 8 minutes after the second engine failure. Flight attendant Santos appeared at Cassandra's seat, her face grim but determined. "The captain requests your immediate assistance in the cockpit," Maria said. "She needs an experienced 737 pilot to help evaluate our options." Cassandra unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. Around her, passengers watched with a mixture of hope and fear as she walked toward the front of the aircraft. Some seemed reassured by the knowledge that an additional pilot was on board. Others appeared more frightened, interpreting her summons as confirmation that the situation was even worse than they'd been told. As she walked down the aisle toward the cockpit door, Cassandra felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. 9 months ago, she'd been stripped of her authority to make decisions about aircraft and passengers. Now in the most desperate circumstances imaginable, she was being called upon to help save lives using skills that bureaucrats had declared she was unfit to use. The cockpit door opened, and Cassandra stepped back into the world she'd been forced to abandon. The cockpit of Southwest Flight 847 was a scene of controlled chaos when Cassandra stepped through the reinforced door. Captain Jennifer Walsh and First Officer David Chun were working with methodical intensity, their hands moving across instrument panels and communication equipment with the practiced efficiency of experienced aviators facing their worst nightmare. "Captain Walsh, I'm Cassandra Mitchell," she announced, moving immediately to the observer's seat behind the center console. "Former Summit Airlines captain, 18,000 hours in 737s. What's our situation?" Walsh glanced back briefly, her face etched with concentration and stress. "Both engines failed within 6 minutes of each other. We're currently at 14,000 feet, descending at approximately 1,800 feet per minute. Salt Lake is too far, and we're running out of altitude fast." First Officer Chun looked up from his charts and navigation displays. "We've identified 3 possible landing sites within our glide range. The problem is, none of them are ideal. There's a small regional airport in Moab, but the runway is only 4,200 feet long and surrounded by canyon walls. Price has a longer runway, but we'd be landing with a significant tailwind. And there's Highway 191. It's straight enough for about 3 miles, but it runs through populated areas." Cassandra immediately began processing the information, her mind shifting into the analytical mode that had served her through thousands of hours of flight operations. She knew this region of Utah from her years flying transcontinental routes. Each option presented unique challenges that could easily prove fatal if not executed perfectly. "What's our current glide ratio?" she asked, already calculating in her head. "We're managing about 17 to 1 right now," Walsh replied. "Better than book performance, but we're fighting headwinds from the west." Cassandra nodded. The Boeing 737's published glide ratio was closer to 15 to 1 under ideal conditions, so the crew was doing excellent work maintaining the aircraft's energy. But 17 to 1 meant they could travel 17 miles forward for every mile of altitude lost. With 14,000 feet of altitude remaining, that gave them roughly 45 miles of range, assuming they could maintain current performance. "Show me Moab," she said, leaning forward to examine Chun's navigation display. The regional airport appeared on the screen, a thin line of asphalt carved into the red sandstone landscape of southeastern Utah. Surrounding terrain was spectacular under normal circumstances: towering rock formations, deep canyons, and the Colorado River winding through desert valleys. For an aircraft in emergency descent, it represented a maze of obstacles that could tear apart a Boeing 737 if the approach wasn't executed with surgical precision. "The runway alignment is good," Chun noted. "We'd be landing essentially straight into the wind. But look at the approach path. We'd have to clear those mesas by less than 200 feet, and there's no room for error. If we come in too high, we overshoot into the canyon. Too low, and we hit the rocks." Walsh was working the radio, coordinating with air traffic control and emergency services. "Denver Center, Southwest 847. We're evaluating emergency landing options. Request immediate clearance of Moab Regional Airport and notification of emergency services. Southwest 847. Denver Center, understand emergency landing Moab Regional. Airport is being cleared now. Emergency equipment is rolling. Be advised runway 0321, 4,200 feet long, 75 feet wide. Current winds 04, at 12 knots. Cassandra was studying the topographical display, her experienced eye tracing the approach path they would need to fly. The challenge wasn't just the short runway, it was the incredibly narrow margin for error imposed by the surrounding terrain. Commercial aircraft were designed to land at airports with long runways and wide approach corridors. Moab Regional was built for small private planes and regional aircraft, not fully loaded Boeing 737s traveling at emergency approach speeds. "What's our current weight?" she asked. "Approximately 142,000 pounds, Chun replied after checking his load manifest. "We took on full fuel for the Phoenix flight, and we haven't had time to burn much off." The number sent a chill through Cassandra's experienced mind. A Boeing 737-700 at that weight would need nearly every foot of a 6,000-foot runway under normal circumstances. Landing on a 4,200-foot strip would require airspeed management so precise that even a 5-knot error could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. "We need to dump fuel," she said immediately. Walsh shook her head grimly. 737-700 doesn't have fuel dumping capability. "We're stuck with what we've got." It was a harsh reminder of the limitations they faced. Larger aircraft like the 777 or 747 were equipped with fuel dumping systems precisely for emergencies like this. But the 737, designed for shorter domestic routes, lacked that capability. Every pound of fuel they'd loaded in Denver was still on board, adding to their weight and increasing their landing distance requirements. "Okay, different approach," Cassandra said, her mind racing through alternatives. "What if we configure for maximum drag? Full flaps, landing gear down early, even deploy the speed brakes if necessary. We can stretch our glide time and lose altitude faster in the final approach." "That's going to cost us distance," Chun pointed out. "More drag means less glide range, but it also means we can approach the field at a steeper angle, which gives us more clearance over those mesas," Walsh said, immediately understanding Cassandra's strategy. "And if we can get the airspeed down to minimum controllable, we might be able to stop within 4,200 feet. The three pilots quickly ran through the calculations. By configuring the aircraft for maximum drag and approaching at the slowest possible safe airspeed, they could potentially achieve the steep approach angle needed to clear the terrain and the slow touchdown speed necessary to stop on the short runway. But it would leave no margin for error. Any miscalculation, any gust of wind, any momentary lapse in concentration could be fatal." "There's another problem," Cassandra said, studying the approach path more carefully. "Look at this terrain masking. We're going to lose radio contact with Denver Center once we descend below the mesa level. And there's no instrument approach into Moab. We'll be flying this entirely visual." It was another complication in an already impossibly difficult situation. Modern commercial aviation relied heavily on ground-based navigation aids and air traffic control guidance. Moab Regional, serving primarily private aircraft and small charter flights, lacked the sophisticated instrument landing systems found at major airports. They would have to navigate the approach using only their eyes and basic navigation equipment, threading the aircraft through canyon country without external guidance. "I've got an idea," Walsh said suddenly. "Cassandra, you know this region better than either of us. You mentioned flying transcontinental routes. Have you ever been into Moab before?" "Not in a 737, Cassandra replied. "But I've flown smaller aircraft into similar strips. The key is energy management. We need to arrive at the threshold with just enough speed to maintain control, but not so much that we can't stop." She paused, studying the navigation display with intense concentration. A memory was surfacing from her early flying career, back when she'd worked for a charter company flying executives and cargo into remote airstrips throughout the western United States. One particular flight stood out: a challenging approach into a short mountain runway during deteriorating weather conditions. The technique she'd used then might be applicable now. "There's a technique called the carrier approach," she said slowly. "Navy pilots use it to land on aircraft carriers. You fly a steeper than normal glide path, using power to control your descent rate. Obviously we don't have power, but we can use configuration changes and speed brakes to achieve the same effect." Walsh and Chun exchanged glances. Both were experienced commercial pilots, but neither had military backgrounds or experience with unconventional approach techniques. They were trained to fly precise, standardized procedures into well-equipped airports. What Cassandra was suggesting was completely outside their normal operational framework. "Walk us through it," Walsh said decisively. "The principle is simple. Instead of flying a shallow, 3-degree glide path like we normally would, we come in steep, maybe 6 or 7 degrees. That gives us obstacle clearance over the mesas. We use drag devices, flaps, gear, speed brakes to control our rate of descent. The key is timing the final configuration changes to arrive at the runway threshold at exactly the right speed and altitude." As she explained the technique, Cassandra felt muscle memory and theoretical knowledge combining in ways she hadn't experienced since her termination from Summit Airlines. This was what she'd been trained for, what 23 years of flying experience had prepared her to handle. For the first time in months, she felt truly useful, truly needed. "The risk is obvious," she continued. "If we get too slow, we stall and crash into the desert. If we maintain too much speed, we overrun the runway and crash into the canyon. The margin for error is essentially zero, but it's our best option," Walsh said grimly. "Highway 191 runs through populated areas. Even if we could make a successful landing, we might kill people on the ground. Price Municipal has better runway length, but the tailwind component would add another 20 knots to our approach speed." First Officer Chun had been listening carefully while working his navigation equipment. "I can give you precise distance and altitude callouts during the approach. We've got GPS navigation and a radar altimeter. If we establish specific parameters for each mile final, we can monitor our progress and make corrections." "That's good thinking," Cassandra said. "We need to treat this like a precision instrument approach, even though we're flying it visually. Specific altitudes at specific distances, with go-no-go decision points along the way." The aircraft was passing through 10,000 feet now, still descending steadily as the pilots worked out the details of their emergency approach. Through the cockpit windows, the landscape of eastern Utah spread out below them, a stunning vista of red rock formations, deep canyons, and high desert that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. Southwest 847. Denver Center. Be advised we're losing radar contact. You're cleared for any and all approaches into Moab Regional. Emergency equipment is standing by. Denver Center. Southwest 847. Understand. We're beginning our approach into Moab. We'll contact you on 121.5. If able after landing. The frequency change marked a critical transition. They were now essentially on their own, cut off from air traffic control and relying entirely on their own navigation and decision-making. The weight of responsibility settled more heavily on all three pilots as they realized that the next 15 minutes would determine whether 200 people lived or died. "Okay," Walsh said, her voice carrying new determination. "Cassandra, I'm designating you as an additional crew member for this approach. David, you handle navigation and callouts. I'll fly the aircraft. Cassandra, you monitor our energy management and advise on configuration changes." It was an unprecedented situation, a terminated pilot with a suspended license being given operational authority in a commercial aircraft emergency. But Captain Walsh understood that expertise mattered more than bureaucratic status when lives were at stake. She was making a command decision that prioritized passenger safety over regulatory protocol. "Understood," Cassandra replied, feeling the familiar weight of flight responsibility settling on her shoulders. "Recommend we configure landing flaps now and get the gear down. We need to start building drag and getting established in landing configuration." "Flaps 30. Landing," Walsh announced, moving the flap lever. The aircraft shuddered slightly as the high lift devices extended, increasing both lift and drag. Gear down. The landing gear extension added significantly more drag, and their descent rate increased accordingly. But it also meant they were now committed to landing. There would be no possibility of retracting the gear and attempting to reach an alternative airport. 7,000 feet. Chun called out. Moab Regional bearing 095, distance 23 miles. Through the windscreen, they could see the airport in the distance, a thin line of gray asphalt surrounded by red sandstone cliffs and desert vegetation. It looked impossibly small from their current altitude, like trying to land a commercial airliner on a postage stamp attached to the side of a mountain. Deploy speed brakes, Cassandra advised. We need to increase our descent rate to make the approach angle work. The speed brakes extended with a mechanical whine, disrupting the smooth airflow over the wings and creating additional drag. Their descent rate increased further, but Walsh maintained precise control of their airspeed, keeping it just above the minimum needed for safe flight. 5,000 feet, 15 miles out, Chun reported. We're on profile for the approach, but Cassandra was watching the terrain ahead with growing concern. The mesas surrounding Moab Regional were higher than she'd initially calculated, and their current approach angle might not provide sufficient clearance. They needed to be more aggressive with their descent, which meant accepting even less margin for error in the final approach. We need to steepen the approach, she said urgently. Those cliffs are going to be a factor. Recommend we plan for a 7-degree glide path minimum. It was a radical departure from normal commercial aviation procedures, where approaches were flown at gentle 3-degree angles for passenger comfort and safety margins. 7 degrees would feel like falling out of the sky, but it was the only way to clear the obstacles and still have a chance of landing safely. 3,000 feet. 8 miles out, First Officer Chun announced, his voice tight with concentration. Altitude looks good for our profile, but we're starting to encounter some thermal activity from the desert floor. The Boeing 737 bucked and swayed as it encountered rising columns of heated air from the sun-baked sandstone below. What would normally be minor turbulence requiring slight course corrections had become a serious threat to their precision approach. Every unexpected updraft or downdraft could throw off their carefully calculated descent path, potentially making the difference between a successful landing and a catastrophic impact. Captain Walsh fought the controls, using minute adjustments to maintain their target airspeed and descent angle. Her hands moved with practiced precision across the yoke and throttles, except the throttles were useless now, providing no power to help correct their flight path. Everything depended on managing the aircraft's energy through configuration changes and careful use of aerodynamic surfaces. Speed brakes are at maximum deployment, Cassandra reported, monitoring the drag devices that were helping them maintain the steep approach angle. We're committed now, no way to stretch our glide if we need more distance. She was acutely aware that they were operating in a regime where normal commercial aviation procedures didn't apply. Every decision they'd made in the past 10 minutes had taken them further from standard operating practices and deeper into experimental flight territory. But experimental was their only option when facing a situation that no training manual had ever contemplated. Through the windscreen, Moab Regional Airport was becoming clearly visible, though it still looked impossibly small for a commercial airliner. The runway appeared as a narrow ribbon of asphalt surrounded by dramatic red rock formations that rose like walls on either side. It was breathtakingly beautiful scenery that had attracted tourists and photographers for decades. But for the pilots of Flight 847, those same rock walls represented deadly obstacles that could destroy their aircraft if their approach wasn't executed perfectly. 2,000 feet, 5 miles, Chun called out. We need to start our final descent profile now if we're going to make this work. Cassandra studied the approach path ahead, mentally calculating angles and distances with the experience gained from thousands of landings in various aircraft types. The mathematics were unforgiving. They needed to lose approximately 1,800 feet of altitude over the next 5 miles while maintaining enough airspeed to keep the aircraft controllable. That translated to a descent rate of nearly 2,000 feet per minute, far steeper than anything a commercial airliner would normally attempt. "I'm going to need both of you calling out deviations," Walsh said, her voice steady despite the enormous pressure. "Airspeed, altitude, descent rate, anything that looks wrong, speak up immediately. We get one chance at this." The crew coordination that followed represented commercial aviation at its finest. Despite the fact that Cassandra technically had no official authority on the aircraft, the 3 pilots worked together with seamless professionalism. Their shared expertise focused entirely on the task of safely landing their disabled aircraft. 1,800 feet, 4 miles out, Chun reported. Descent rate 1,900 feet per minute. Airspeed 165 knots. Airspeed is 5 knots high, Cassandra noted. "Recommend we accept the extra speed for now. Better to have energy we can dissipate than to get too slow and lose control." She was thinking like a test pilot now, constantly balancing competing risks and making real-time decisions based on incomplete information. Commercial airline pilots were trained to follow precise, standardized procedures that had been refined over decades of safe operations. But their current situation demanded the kind of adaptive thinking that only came from deep understanding of aerodynamic principles and years of experience handling unusual situations. The thermal turbulence intensified as they descended lower into the desert air mass. The aircraft pitched and rolled unpredictably, requiring constant control inputs from Captain Walsh to maintain their intended flight path. Passengers in the cabin were experiencing violent motion as the Boeing 737 bucked and swayed through the unstable air. But the cockpit crew had no choice but to continue their approach. They were too low on altitude to attempt reaching any alternative landing site. 1,200 feet, 3 miles, Chun announced. "We're slightly high on the profile." "I see it," Walsh replied, pushing the nose down slightly to increase their descent rate. "Cassandra, how much altitude do we need to clear that mesa ahead?" Cassandra studied the terrain through the windscreen, using her experienced eye to judge the height of the rock formations that lay directly in their approach path. The sandstone cliffs rose from the desert floor in dramatic vertical walls, creating a narrow corridor through which they had to thread their 140-foot-long aircraft. Minimum clearance is going to be about 300 feet, she estimated. But that's if we hit our altitude target exactly. If we're high by even 100 feet at that point, we'll be cutting it too close for safety. The margin for error was shrinking with every mile they flew closer to the airport. What had seemed like a challenging but manageable approach from 10,000 feet now revealed itself as an almost impossibly precise feat of airmanship. They were attempting to land a fully loaded commercial airliner at an airport designed for aircraft less than half their size, using approach techniques that no commercial pilot had ever been required to master. 800 feet, 2 miles out, Chun called. Descent rate 2,100 feet per minute. Airspeed 160 knots. Deploy full flaps, Cassandra advised. We need maximum drag now to steepen our descent and slow our approach speed. Walsh moved the flap lever to its final position, and the aircraft shuddered as the full flap configuration deployed. The additional lift and drag changed the aircraft's flight characteristics significantly, requiring immediate control inputs to maintain their desired flight path. But the increased drag was allowing them to descend more steeply while maintaining a slower airspeed, exactly what they needed to clear the terrain and land within the confines of the short runway. The Masa Cliff was looming ahead of them now, a vertical wall of red sandstone that seemed to fill the entire windscreen. Passengers who could see forward through the cockpit door were getting their first clear view of the terrain they had to clear, and several were audibly praying or crying as they realized how close they were flying to the rock face. 400 feet, 1 mile out, Chun announced, his voice tight with tension. "We're going to clear the mesa, but it's going to be close." The Boeing 737 passed over the cliff edge with less than 200 feet of clearance, close enough that the pilots could see individual rocks and desert vegetation on the mesa top. The sensation was like flying through a narrow canyon, with vertical walls rising on both sides, and the airport runway stretching ahead like a thin line painted on the desert floor. "Runway in sight," Walsh announced, though her voice carried no relief. Being able to see their destination was only the first step. They still had to execute a landing that would require every ounce of skill and experience the crew possessed. The runway ahead looked impossibly short from their current perspective. Commercial pilots were accustomed to landing on runways that stretched for 8,000 to 12,000 feet, providing ample room for normal approach speeds and braking distances. Moab Regional's 4,200-foot runway would require them to touch down at the absolute minimum controllable airspeed and execute perfect braking technique from the moment their wheels contacted the pavement. 200 feet, half mile, Chun reported. Airspeed 145 knots. Descent rate 1,800 feet per minute. "Still too fast," Cassandra noted. "We need to get down to 130 knots absolute minimum, or we'll never stop within the available runway length." It was a critical decision point. They could continue their current approach and hope to dissipate the excess speed after touchdown, or they could execute a dramatic speed reduction in the final 2,000 feet of approach. The first option risked overrunning the runway and crashing into the canyon beyond. The second option risked stalling the aircraft and crashing short of the runway. "I'm going to use a forward slip," Walsh announced, making a split-second decision that demonstrated both her skill and her desperation. A forward slip was an advanced piloting technique where the aircraft was deliberately flown in an uncoordinated manner, using crossed controls to increase drag and steepen the descent angle without increasing airspeed. It was a technique more commonly used by aerobatic pilots and glider pilots than commercial airline captains, but it was exactly what they needed to lose both altitude and speed in the final moments of their approach. Walsh applied left rudder, while simultaneously turning the control yoke to the right, creating a condition where the aircraft's nose pointed slightly away from its actual direction of travel. The result was a dramatic increase in drag as the fuselage presented a larger profile to the relative wind, allowing them to descend more steeply while actually reducing their airspeed. 100 feet, quarter mile, Chun called out. Airspeed 135 knots and decreasing. The runway was rushing toward them now, no longer a distant line on the desert, but a concrete reality that would determine whether their desperate gambit would succeed or fail. Emergency vehicles were positioned along both sides of the runway. Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue equipment that represented both hope for survival and acknowledgement of the disaster that might be about to unfold. 50 feet, 500 yards, Chun announced. Airspeed 132 knots. Descent rate 1,200 feet per minute. "Flare now," Cassandra advised, recognizing the critical moment when they needed to begin the landing transition. Captain Walsh pulled back on the yoke, raising the aircraft's nose to reduce the steep descent angle and prepare for touchdown. It was the most delicate moment of the entire approach. Too much flare would cause them to balloon upward and potentially stall, while insufficient flare would result in a hard impact that could collapse the landing gear. The Boeing 737 crossed the runway threshold at exactly 130 knots, just 2 knots above the minimum controllable airspeed for their current weight and configuration. It was a testament to the skill of all 3 pilots that they had managed to arrive at this critical point with their aircraft still under control and their speed within the narrow range that gave them a chance of survival. "Main gear contact," Walsh announced as the aircraft's main landing gear touched the runway with a solid thump that resonated throughout the cabin. But touchdown was only the beginning of their challenge. With 4,200 feet of runway ahead of them and an aircraft weighing 142,000 pounds traveling at 130 knots. They now faced the equally critical task of bringing the Boeing 737 to a complete stop before running out of pavement. Speed brakes deployed, maximum reverse thrust. Oh wait, we don't have reverse thrust, Walsh said, the momentary lapse revealing the stress she was under. Without engine power, they had no thrust reversers to help slow the aircraft. Maximum wheel brakes, Cassandra advised. But be careful not to lock them up on this short runway. We can't afford a blown tire or brake fire. Walsh applied the wheel brakes with practiced precision, feeling the aircraft begin to decelerate as the brake systems fought to convert their kinetic energy into heat. Through the windscreen, the far end of the runway was becoming visible, a line beyond which lay only empty desert and the canyon wall that would destroy them if they failed to stop in time. 3,000 feet of runway remaining, Chun called out, reading the distance markers painted on the pavement. It was still traveling at over 80 knots, fast enough that overrunning the runway remained a serious possibility. The wheel brakes were generating enormous heat as they worked to slow the massive aircraft, and Cassandra could smell the distinctive odor of hot brake pads that indicated the systems were being pushed to their absolute limits. 2,000 feet remaining, speed 60 knots. Chun reported that the numbers were getting better, but they were still in the danger zone. At 60 knots, the aircraft was moving at nearly 70 miles per hour fast, enough to cause serious damage if they ran off the end of the runway. But the deceleration was continuing, and for the first time since the engines had failed, Cassandra began to believe they might actually survive. 1,000 feet remaining. Speed 40 knots. Emergency vehicles were racing alongside the runway now, keeping pace with the decelerating aircraft and ready to respond if the landing turned into a disaster. Through the side windows, the pilots could see firefighters and paramedics preparing for whatever outcome the next few seconds would bring. 500 feet remaining. Speed 25 knots. Walsh continued applying steady brake pressure, coaxing every possible bit of deceleration from the aircraft systems without risking a loss of directional control. The Boeing 737 was tracking straight down the center of the runway, but they were rapidly approaching the point where success or failure would be determined by physics rather than piloting skill. 200 feet remaining. Speed 15 knots. We're going to make it, Chun said, his voice filled with amazement and relief. The Boeing 737 rolled to a complete stop with less than 100 feet of runway remaining, its nose wheel just 300 feet from the canyon wall that had represented certain death throughout their approach. For several seconds, the cockpit was completely silent as all three pilots absorbed the reality that they had successfully landed a disabled commercial airliner at an airport where such an event should have been impossible. Southwest 847, Moab Tower. We show you stopped on the runway. Emergency equipment is rolling. Are you declaring an emergency evacuation? Captain Walsh keyed her microphone with a hand that was visibly shaking from the adrenaline and stress of the past 30 minutes. Moab Tower, Southwest 847. We are stopped safely on runway 03. No evacuation required at this time. Request emergency equipment standing by while we assess our situation and prepare for normal deplaning. In the cabin behind them, 197 passengers sat in stunned silence, many of them crying with relief as they realized they had survived what should have been an unsurvivable emergency. Flight attendants were already moving through the aisles, checking for injuries and beginning the process of preparing for deplaning at an airport that had never before hosted a commercial airliner. Cassandra unbuckled her harness and stood up from the observer's seat, her legs unsteady from the combination of adrenaline and the emotional impact of what they had just accomplished. 9 months ago, she had been told she was unfit to serve as a commercial pilot. Today, her expertise had helped save 200 lives in one of the most challenging aviation emergencies in recent history. Excellent work, both of you, she said to Captain Walsh and First Officer Chun. "That was some of the finest flying I've ever witnessed." But even as she spoke those words, Cassandra knew that the real test was just beginning. They had landed safely, but now they faced questions about her unauthorized presence in the cockpit, the unconventional techniques they had used, and the regulatory implications of a grounded pilot providing critical assistance during an emergency. The bureaucratic system that had destroyed her career would now have to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that the same expertise it had declared dangerous had just proven essential for saving lives. The silence that followed the successful landing of Southwest Flight 847 lasted exactly 43 seconds. Then the radio crackled to life with a cascade of transmissions from air traffic control centers across the western United States, all wanting confirmation of what had just occurred at the small desert airport in southeastern Utah. Southwest 847. Salt Lake Center, confirm you are on the ground at Moab with all souls on board safe. Denver Center to Southwest 847, we show you stopped. What is your current status, and do you require additional emergency assistance? Southwest 847, this is Phoenix Approach. We have your company dispatch on the line requesting immediate contact regarding passenger manifest and aircraft status. Captain Jennifer Walsh methodically responded to each transmission, providing the essential information while trying to process the enormity of what they had just accomplished. But even as she handled the radio communications, she was acutely aware that their emergency was far from over. Landing safely had been only the first challenge. Now they faced the complex task of accounting for their actions during an event that had no precedent in commercial aviation. Aircraft's passenger address system crackled as Walsh switched to the cabin frequency. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are safely on the ground at Moab Regional Airport in Utah. Emergency personnel are standing by as a precaution, but we do not anticipate any need for emergency evacuation. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened while we coordinate with ground personnel and prepare for normal deplaning procedures." Through the cockpit windows, they could see a growing assembly of emergency vehicles, airport personnel, and what appeared to be news crews who had somehow already arrived at the remote airport. The story of Flight 847's emergency landing was spreading rapidly through aviation communications, networks, and social media, drawing attention from across the country to the small desert community that had never before hosted such a dramatic event. First Officer David Chun was working through post-landing checklists, shutting down unnecessary systems and preparing the aircraft for an extended ground stay. Without engine power, many of their normal electrical and hydraulic systems were operating on backup power that would eventually be depleted. They needed to connect to ground power sources quickly to maintain essential systems for passenger comfort and aircraft security. "David, I need you to coordinate with the ground crew for external power and air conditioning," Walsh instructed. "This aircraft isn't going anywhere soon, and we need to keep our passengers comfortable while we sort out the logistics of getting them to their destinations." But Cassandra was thinking beyond the immediate operational concerns. She knew that within hours, federal investigators would descend on Moab to begin examining every aspect of the emergency. The National Transportation Safety Board would want to understand exactly how both engines had failed, why their emergency procedures had deviated so dramatically from standard practices, and most critically, why a pilot with a suspended license had been allowed to participate in the cockpit decision-making process. "Jennifer," she said quietly, using Captain Walsh's first name for the first time during their brief but intense collaboration, "we need to discuss what happens next. The investigators are going to have serious questions about my involvement in this flight." Walsh turned to face her, and for the first time since the emergency began, Cassandra saw uncertainty in the captain's eyes. The adrenaline of the crisis was beginning to wear off, replaced by the sobering realization that their successful landing might create as many problems as it had solved. You saved 200 lives today, Walsh said firmly. Whatever regulatory issues come up, that's the bottom line. Your expertise made the difference between success and disaster. The FAA might not see it that way. Cassandra replied, I'm not current on any aircraft type. My medical certificate expired months ago, and I was specifically prohibited from acting in any official capacity on commercial aircraft. From their perspective, I violated multiple federal regulations today. Chun looked up from his checklists, having overheard the conversation. But those regulations don't address emergency situations like this. Surely there must be some provision for using available expertise when lives are at stake. It was a reasonable assumption. But Cassandra's experience with aviation bureaucracy had taught her that reasonableness and regulatory compliance weren't always the same thing. The federal aviation system was built on strict adherence to procedures and protocols, with limited tolerance for deviation, even in extraordinary circumstances. The cabin door chimed, and flight attendant Maria Santos appeared in the cockpit doorway. Her professional composure was intact, but the stress of the emergency was evident in her voice and posture. Captain, the passengers are asking when they'll be able to deplane. Several people are requesting medical attention, mostly anxiety and stress-related issues. But we should probably get paramedics on board to evaluate anyone who needs care. Coordinate with the emergency medical personnel outside, Walsh instructed. And let the passengers know we're working on deplaning procedures. This airport wasn't designed for aircraft our size, so it's going to take some creativity to get everyone off safely. As Santos returned to the cabin, Cassandra made a decision that she knew would complicate her life even further. I should probably remove myself from the cockpit before the investigators arrive. The longer I stay here, the more questions there will be about my role in the emergency response. Absolutely not, Walsh said immediately. You're part of this crew now, and we're going to face whatever comes next together. Besides, trying to hide your involvement would just make things worse if it comes out later, which it will. Through the windscreen, they could see the first of what would undoubtedly be many official vehicles arriving at the airport. A black SUV with government plates was pulling up near the terminal building, and Cassandra recognized the purposeful movement of federal agents beginning their preliminary investigation of the incident. Southwest 847, Moab Tower. We have FAG inspectors on site requesting permission to board the aircraft for initial safety assessment. They're also asking to interview the flight crew at your earliest convenience. The inevitable moment had arrived. Within minutes, Cassandra would face federal aviation officials for the first time since her termination from Summit Airlines. But now, instead of being questioned about a security incident she'd had nothing to do with, she would be explaining why she'd participated in cockpit operations without proper certification or authority. Moab Tower, Southwest 847, will accept the FAA inspectors on board. Please coordinate with our flight attendants for boarding procedures, Walsh replied. She turned to Cassandra and Chun. Listen carefully, both of you. We're going to tell the complete truth about everything that happened during this emergency. We made decisions based on the information available and the expertise of everyone involved. We saved lives, and I'm not going to apologize for that to anyone. The first inspector to board was Regional Flight Standards Manager Robert Hayes, a career FAA official whom Cassandra recognized from her previous encounters with the Denver Flight Standards District Office. Hayes was methodical and professional, but she could see the surprise in his eyes when he spotted her in the cockpit. Captain Walsh, I'm Inspector Hayes with the Flight Standards District Office. I need to conduct preliminary interviews with all crew members regarding the emergency procedures used during this incident. His gaze shifted to Cassandra. I wasn't aware that Summit Airlines had assigned a check airman to this flight. Mr. Hayes, I'm no longer employed by Summit Airlines, Cassandra said before Walsh could respond. I was a passenger on this flight who provided assistance to the crew during the emergency. The inspector's expression shifted from surprise to confusion, then to what appeared to be recognition as he recalled the circumstances of Cassandra's termination from commercial aviation. "Ms. Mitchell, you're aware that your pilot certificate is currently suspended and that you're prohibited from performing pilot duties on commercial aircraft." "I am aware of the regulatory restrictions on my certificate," she replied carefully. "However, when faced with a situation where my knowledge might help save lives, I felt obligated to assist the crew in any way possible." Inspector Hayes made notes on his clipboard, clearly recognizing that he was dealing with a situation far outside normal investigative parameters. "I'm going to need detailed statements from each of you regarding the decision-making process during this emergency. The investigation will need to determine whether proper procedures were followed and whether any regulatory violations occurred." Over the next 2 hours, the 3 pilots were interviewed separately about every aspect of the emergency. Cassandra provided a detailed chronology of her involvement, from the moment she identified herself as a pilot to Flight Attendant Santos, through her participation in the approach planning and execution. She was careful to be completely honest about her actions, while emphasizing that her only motivation had been passenger safety. Captain Walsh's interview was equally thorough, with particular focus on her decision to request Cassandra's assistance in the cockpit. "Inspector Hayes, when you're facing dual engine failure at 30,000 feet with 200 people on board, you use every available resource to ensure their safety. Ms. Mitchell's expertise was invaluable in developing and executing the approach that saved this aircraft." First Officer Chun corroborated both accounts, providing technical details about the approach procedures they had used and the critical role that Cassandra's knowledge had played in their success. "Without her input on the carrier approach technique and energy management, I don't believe we could have achieved the precision necessary to land safely at Moab." While the crew interviews were taking place, passengers were finally beginning to deplane using portable stairs that had been brought from Salt Lake City. The process was slow and complicated by the fact that Moab Regional's terminal building was designed for aircraft carrying fewer than 50 people, not nearly 200 commercial airline passengers. Among the passengers emerging from the aircraft was Dr. Patricia Hoffman, a retired aerospace engineer who had witnessed much of the emergency from her seat in row 12. As she descended the stairs, she was approached by a reporter from a Salt Lake City television station who had driven to Moab as soon as news of the emergency landing broke. "I've never seen anything like what those pilots accomplished," Dr. Hoffman told the reporter. "The approach they flew was completely outside normal procedures, but it was exactly what was needed given the circumstances. And I heard from other passengers that there was actually a 4th pilot helping in the cockpit, someone who wasn't originally part of the crew." The reporter's interest was immediately piqued. "Can you tell us more about this additional pilot?" "I don't know the details, but passengers who could see toward the front said a woman went into the cockpit during the emergency and was actively involved in landing the plane." "If that's true, then we owe our lives to 4 pilots, not 3. The interview was broadcast live on the evening news, and within hours the story of the mystery 4th pilot was spreading across social media and aviation forums. Speculation ran wild about who the additional crew member might have been and what role she had played in the dramatic rescue. Meanwhile, back at the aircraft, Inspector Hayes was concluding his preliminary investigation with a mixture of admiration and regulatory concern. He had 30 years of experience investigating aviation incidents, but he had never encountered a situation where a pilot with a suspended license had provided essential assistance during a commercial airline emergency. "Captain Walsh, based on my interviews and preliminary examination of the aircraft, it appears that you and your crew performed admirably under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. The techniques you used were unconventional, but they were appropriate given your situation." He paused, clearly struggling with the regulatory implications of what he was about to say. "However, the involvement of Miss Mitchell creates some significant complications. Regardless of her expertise or the positive outcome, she did perform pilot duties while her certificate was suspended. That's a violation of federal regulations that carries serious penalties. Walsh stepped forward. Inspector Hayes, if you're going to file charges against anyone for regulatory violations, I want it clearly understood that I requested Ms. Mitchell's assistance and authorized her participation in cockpit operations. Any violation of regulations was my decision as pilot in command, and I supported that decision completely, Chun added. Ms. Mitchell's knowledge was essential to our success. Punishing her for helping to save lives would be completely unjust. Inspector Hayes closed his notebook and looked at the three pilots with an expression that mixed professional duty with personal respect. The final determination on any regulatory action will be made by headquarters after a complete investigation. But I want all three of you to know that what you accomplished today will be studied and remembered in aviation circles for years to come. As the sun set over the red rock landscape surrounding Moab, the immediate crisis of Flight 847 was drawing to a close. Passengers were being transported to hotels in the area, while arrangements were made for alternative transportation to their original destinations. The aircraft itself would remain at Moab for several days while investigators determined the cause of the dual-engine failure and evaluated the damage from the emergency landing. But for Cassandra Mitchell, the aftermath was just beginning. Within 48 hours, her story would be headline news across the country. Aviation experts would debate the regulatory and ethical implications of her actions. And somewhere in the labyrinthine offices of the Federal Aviation Administration, officials would wrestle with a question that had never before been seriously considered. What happens when breaking the rules is the only way to save lives? The woman who had been destroyed by bureaucratic inflexibility 9 months earlier now found herself at the center of a national conversation about the balance between regulatory compliance and human judgment. She had proven beyond any doubt that her skills as a pilot remained sharp and her commitment to safety was absolute. The question now was whether the system that had cast her out would have the wisdom to acknowledge that sometimes expertise matters more than paperwork. As she finally left the aircraft that had become the stage for her redemption, Cassandra realized that her fight for vindication had only just begun. But for the first time since that devastating morning in March, when she had lost everything, she felt ready for the battle ahead. 6 weeks after Flight 847's emergency landing at Moab, Cassandra Mitchell sat in a conference room at FAA headquarters in Washington, D.C., facing a panel of aviation officials who would determine her professional fate. The room was sterile and intimidating, with American flags flanking a long table where 5 senior administrators reviewed thick folders containing the complete investigation into the incident. Administrator Rachel Sterling, the FAA's highest-ranking safety official, led the proceedings. Ms. Mitchell, this review board has completed its investigation into your actions during Southwest Flight 847's emergency on April 29th. Before we announce our findings, do you have any final statements you'd like to make? Cassandra had spent weeks preparing for this moment, working with aviation attorneys and reviewing every detail of federal regulations. But as she stood to address the panel, she decided to speak from the heart rather than from legal strategy. Administrator Sterling, 6 weeks ago, I faced a choice between following regulations that would have left 200 people to die, or using the knowledge I've spent 23 years acquiring to help save their lives. I chose to act, knowing full well the regulatory implications. I would make the same choice again without hesitation. She paused, looking directly at each panel member. The system failed me 9 months ago when I was terminated for an innocent conversation with a passenger I didn't know was carrying fake explosives. But the knowledge and experience that system tried to take away from me proved essential when it mattered most. I violated technical regulations, but I upheld the highest principle of aviation, safety above all else. Administrator Sterling consulted her notes. Ms. Mitchell, Our investigation has revealed several troubling facts about your original suspension. The security incident that led to your termination was based entirely on circumstantial evidence and guilt by association. Our review found no credible basis for questioning your competence or integrity as a commercial pilot. The words hung in the air like a long overdue apology. Cassandra felt a mixture of vindication and bitter irony. The same officials who had destroyed her career were now acknowledging their mistake, but only after she had risked everything to prove her worth. Furthermore, Sterling continued, our technical analysis of Flight 847's emergency procedures, conducted with input from NASA and military test pilots, concludes that the approach techniques you helped develop were not only appropriate, but represented innovative solutions to an unprecedented crisis. Your expertise directly contributed to saving 197 passengers and crew members. Captain Jennifer Walsh, who had flown to Washington to testify on Cassandra's behalf, smiled from the observer section. First Officer David Chun sat beside her, both pilots having fought tirelessly to ensure that Cassandra received recognition rather than punishment for her actions. However, Sterling added, her tone becoming more formal, we cannot ignore the fact that you performed pilot duties while your certificate was suspended. This creates a regulatory precedent that we must address carefully. Cassandra's attorney leaned forward, but she gestured for him to remain silent. She had expected this moment and was prepared to accept whatever consequences the board deemed appropriate. Therefore, this board has reached the following decisions, Sterling announced. First, Ms. Mitchell's original certificate suspension is hereby lifted, with full acknowledgement that the security incident leading to that action was without merit. Second, all negative references related to that incident will be permanently removed from her record. The conference room erupted in quiet celebration from the observers, but Sterling wasn't finished. Third, regarding the regulatory violations that occurred during Flight 847's emergency, this board finds that Ms. Mitchell's actions, while technically outside normal procedures, were justified by the extraordinary circumstances and the successful outcome. No punitive action will be taken. Cassandra felt her knees weaken with relief. After 9 months of unemployment, financial ruin, and professional exile, she was finally being told that her career could be restored. Finally, Sterling said, her formal tone giving way to something approaching warmth. This board recommends that Ms. Mitchell be considered for the FAA's highest civilian honor, the Wright Brothers Master Pilot Award, in recognition of her contribution to aviation safety and her demonstration of superior airmanship under emergency conditions. The room fell silent as the magnitude of Sterling's words sank in. The Wright Brothers Award was aviation's equivalent of a lifetime achievement recognition, typically reserved for pilots with decades of accident-free service and significant contributions to flight safety. For Cassandra to be nominated after the events of the past year represented not just vindication, but elevation to the highest levels of professional recognition. 3 weeks later, Cassandra walked through the crew entrance at Denver International Airport wearing a crisp Southwest Airlines uniform. The company had not only offered her immediate employment as a captain but had assigned her to their most prestigious routes as a gesture of respect for her role in saving Flight 847. The media attention had been overwhelming. Her story had been featured in aviation magazines, network news programs, and a documentary that was already in production. She had received job offers from major airlines across the country, speaking invitations from aviation organizations, and even a book deal from a major publisher. But more importantly, she had received something that money couldn't buy: the respect and admiration of her fellow pilots. In airports across the country, crew members would approach her to shake her hand and thank her for representing the best traditions of their profession. The same aviation community that had shunned her after her termination now celebrated her as a hero. Captain Walsh, who had become a close friend during the investigation process, met her at the crew lounge for their first flight together since the emergency. Ready to get back to routine flying? she asked with a smile. After Moab, everything else should seem pretty boring, Cassandra replied. But she was grinning as she said it. Their flight that day was routine, Denver to Phoenix. The same route she had been trying to fly as a passenger when Flight 847's engines failed. The passengers had no idea they were being flown by the pilot whose story had captivated the nation. And that's exactly how Cassandra preferred it. During cruise flight, she found herself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought her back to this cockpit. 9 months ago, she had been broken by a system that valued compliance over competence. Today, she was stronger and more confident than she had ever been, with the knowledge that she had faced the ultimate test of her abilities and emerged victorious. Aviation industry had learned important lessons from Flight 847's emergency. New procedures were being developed for utilizing passenger pilots during emergencies. Training programs were incorporating the innovative approach techniques that had made the Moab landing possible. Most importantly, the rigid thinking that had once prioritized regulations over results was slowly giving way to more flexible approaches that recognized the value of human expertise. As Southwest Flight 1247 began its descent into Phoenix, Cassandra keyed the passenger address system. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're beginning our approach into Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. Current weather is clear with light winds, and we expect an on-time arrival. Thank you for flying Southwest Airlines. It was a routine announcement that she had made thousands of times throughout her career. But today, it carried special meaning. She was no longer the grounded pilot fighting for vindication. She was Captain Cassandra Mitchell, and she was exactly where she belonged, in command of an aircraft, responsible for the safety of her passengers, and doing the job she had been born to do. The landing at Phoenix was smooth and uneventful, exactly the kind of routine operation that passengers expected and rarely thought about. As the aircraft rolled to the gate, Cassandra realized that this was what she had missed most during her months in exile, not the drama or recognition, but the simple satisfaction of completing a flight safely and professionally. Her story had become legend in aviation circles, inspiring a new generation of pilots and reminding experienced aviators why they had chosen their profession. But for Cassandra Mitchell, the real victory wasn't the awards or the media attention. It was the knowledge that when everything was on the line, when 200 lives hung in the balance, she had remembered who she was and what she could do. The jet engines spooled down as ground. Crews connected external power and prepared for passenger deplaning. Outside the cockpit windows, the Arizona desert stretched toward the horizon, vast and beautiful under the afternoon sun. It was the same landscape she had seen from Flight 847 during those terrifying minutes when engines failed and the ground rushed up to meet them. But today, it looked different. Today, it looked like home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.